My name is Scott Rozelle. I'm a Shorenstein APARC member for the past 30 years since I've been here at Stanford. And I also am the faculty co-director of the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. And this session has nothing to do with China, though it should if it's to do with sustainability. And But I'm going to introduce the three guest speakers right now, and then we'll go in the order I introduce them. And after they give a talk, they are covering a lot of space and a lot of different issues. I think what we'll do is we'll all ask them, or the other speakers can ask them a question if there's anything that needs clarification or that we want to follow up on, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions after that. So number one, here on the far right, Rafiq Dossani. He's the director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy. I had to read that because he's the former senior research scholar and executive director of the South Asia Initiative here in APARC. And it's great to have you back. Let me introduce all three people first, and he's going to speak first. Next is Scot Marciel, Scott with one T. And he's a former U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, to Indonesia, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And now he is the Oksenberg-Rohlen Fellow at Shorenstein at Stanford, and he's been here. It's been a great contribution to the center and to the whole institute. And then finally, we've been practicing her name the whole time, Latha Palaniappan.
Well done.
Close, okay. Exactly. And she's a professor of medicine and co-founder of the Center for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Health Research and Education at Stanford. Wow. They call it CARE. And we've been tried to be pushed together for the last year or so, and we have many interests. It's great to meet you, Latha. So, Rafiq, you're number one, and get your questions ready.
Thank you, Scott, and happy birthday, APARC. It's a great pleasure to be here again. You said this session has nothing to do with China.
China's. Do you know where China's at, Rafiq?
You'll find out soon. Session is very much about China, but it's about climate change and China. So the starting of this presentation is asking a couple of questions about which there's not much clarity at the moment, which is that what role, you keep reading that the US and China must work together to solve the climate change problem, but it's not clear what they should do. I mean, what you hear, you read things like, yes, the two largest polluters, so you need them, one's 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis, one's 15%, the US second, China first. So if they don't work together, then one can free ride on the other. Or maybe they needed to arrange funding, or maybe they needed to sit on their, work with their coalitions, China representing the developing countries mostly, and the US the developed. So to understand that, that's sort of the purpose of this study. One is how likely is cooperation in an era of geopolitical rivalry. Second is, if it's likely to happen, is it necessary? What role can it play? And how effective can that role be? So my approach and method, just quickly, I'm going to review the negotiation process of the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, and looking only at climate change mitigation, not at adaptation or resilience. So I'll be analyzing the COP process, looking at the only two successful agreements we've had to date through the COP on climate change mitigation, which is the Kyoto Protocol of COP3 in 1997 and the Paris Agreement of 2015. And then, the method I'll use is game theory. So the COP rules and features are pretty friendly towards cooperative styles of negotiation. Although there is no direct requirement to negotiate in a particular way, the very structure is that requires consensus. So, the COP decision-making procedure says consensus is pretty much a must. So if you see that in 1996, the underlying portion, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change proposed a decision-making rule that till today hasn't been agreed to. But as you see, consensus comes in both of them. So there's no consensus on which of the two to go for. But consensus is required in all cases, and that means cooperation is pretty much on the cards. So the question I ask is the COP procedure compatible with the cooperative game? What you see is it sort of fits in, but not quite. So you seek agreement through negotiation, but the problem with the COP decisions is that they're not enforceable. So countries can back off later, and that has happened several times, and we'll come to some discussion of that. The rest of it are standard game theory assumptions, known number of players, the strategy set, the payoff associated with it, and so on. So if given that it's not perfect, but it's not bad, one can look at then at the non-cooperative framework and ask if that fits better for analysis purposes. And the answer again is not quite. Enforcement, if you can find a dominant strategy in a non-cooperative game, then an enforcement should not be required, right? Because you've made your move, which would be a dominant strategy, regardless of what others do. And I'll show an example later. But the problem is, if you have a non-cooperative game, then you don't, there's no scope to adjust, modify, change your goals, and so on. You can have a hybrid, so you start with a cooperative approach, take it to a point, then turn non-cooperative. So that's also something we could consider. So with that description of the COPs, what I'm hoping to convey to you with that is that the structure is cooperative-oriented, cooperation-oriented. Not perfectly so, but it is definitely something that has led to some agreements. Out of the 27 COPs that have been held so far, only 2 have resulted in agreements. So, it's not a great record, but those 2 agreements were quite important. So I'm going to discuss the first one, COP 3, which was the 1997 COP held in Kyoto, which led to the Kyoto Protocol. So at that time, the developing countries were a minority of the emissions. Just 15 developed countries accounted for 55% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, and the growth rates of the non-EU countries were significantly higher in emissions than that of the EU countries. So really the battle at COP3 was not between developing countries and developed countries. It was really a game between the US led what was called the umbrella group and the EU. And the EU was pushing hard on the US to bring the umbrella group, which was the non-US developed countries, Australia, Canada, Japan, and the US. Since then it's expanded. And so that was really the concern. So the EU very much wanted that the US should come in line, and in return it would also agree to abate much more. It was didn't want developing countries to be brought into the game at that point because of funding. The developed countries said they would only fund if they were paid for it. They couldn't afford it on their own. So what we see here is sort of the different positions. So you had 2 coalitions. You had 4 coalitions at the time. One was the EU coalition, which was very united. You had the G77, which was the developing countries coalition led by China, but also Brazil, South Africa, and India. Then you had the umbrella group. It, by the way, took its name, the umbrella group, from the fact that the EU was constantly hammering it for not doing anything on climate change. So the umbrella was the protection name. So that was the US-led group. And then you had the CIS, which was a transition group, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Russian Federation, and the others that made up the ex-Soviet Union. And they were really not, they couldn't afford to pay for anyone else's mitigation, but they could take care of their own. So together with EU and the umbrella group, and these 3 formed what was called the Annex 1 countries. That is, those countries which could pay for their own climate change mitigation. And within that, a second category of Annex 2 countries were those which could also finance, largely the OECD countries, which could also finance other countries' mitigation. And then you had the positions of that applied to the developing countries, the 3. So the first 2 were, there was the EU proposal to cut emissions on a binding basis by 15% for everyone. And then you had the US proposal, so you can see the no's and the yeses there. The umbrella group's proposal, which was to cut it by just 5%. Now, if you look at what was being proposed for the developing countries, it was voluntary emissions control on less developed countries without any financial support. Second was with financial support, but binding emissions, just like the EU and the US would do. And the third, which was the G77 position, was that there shouldn't be any emissions control at all. So given these, you can see the wide variance. If you play a non-cooperative game, there's not going to be an equilibrium. So negotiation actually led to the EU backing down. Pretty much it agreed to go to the US position of 5%. There was some variation within the different groups. The EU agreed to 8%, the US to 6%, Australia got plus 10%. So it varied, but essentially the US position prevailed, which the developing countries saw as very unfair. Because at that level of pollution, the EU was already below in emissions what it had committed to achieve 10 years later in 2010. So, it was, but the US played the game well and didn't want to stop polluting, so that's what happened. As far as the developing countries were concerned, that yellow circle was their position, no emissions control. And you can show this as nicely as a game, where you see, coalition Annex 1 are the developed countries, and the Annex 2 are the developing countries. You can see their positions. Within those positions, obviously both sides favored more emissions control rather than less. So I hope you can see, with the binding emissions control was a yes for Annex 1 and a no for Annex 2 for the G77, sorry. And the voluntary emissions control was a yes for the Annex 1 and no for the developing countries. And then you can rank them quite easily. Obviously, both the developed countries wanted yes, they wanted both sides to stop polluting, and so on. I won't spend much time on that, but happy to talk it through, just in the interest of time. And then you come to so the coalition has a core at 2-1, which means that developed countries will abate and developing countries will continue to pollute. Now, this is interesting because subsequent to Kyoto, there was a lot of criticism of developing countries that they were continuing to pollute. But that was what they'd signed up for. There was no other agreement, on that. And you can see the greenhouse, the free riding effect quite nicely here. Just look at, I'm assuming here you have coalition 1 are the developed countries, coalition 2 are the developing countries. I've just created a simple game of abate versus pollute. So assume that each one generates through their actions 3 units of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So you want this number to be high. But for developed countries, it costs less. They're further along in their emissions control. Developing countries have a long way to go. So the long-run marginal cost is significantly lower, and I'll show you some numbers later for developed and developing countries. So, and each one generates 3 units. So if you look at abate, 6 is the sort of the gross benefit to each. Developed countries pay 2, and so their net benefit is 4. Developing countries pay 4 because it's more costly for them. Their net benefit is 2. And then you can run through the others. So if you look at this game, let's say coalition 1 chooses abate. Then since 3 is greater than 2 in the first row, developing countries will choose to pollute. And if you go through this exercise, if you see if developed countries choose to pollute, developing countries choose to pollute. So they always pollute. So it's a dominant strategy for them. And if you look now at coalition 2, the columns, what they do, if coalition 2 abates, coalition 1 will abate, right? 4 is greater than 3, and likewise 1 is greater than 0 in the second column. So the equilibrium is abate, pollute. So, it's not surprising then if you look at the aftermath of what happened with Kyoto, the US decided, pretty much on ideological reasons, I think, although that's not what George Bush said in his campaign speeches, to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, followed by other umbrella group members. So they all withdrew. And that broke the developed country coalition that was really at the heart of what was supposed to be done and led to the protocol's failure. So now I move 18 years later to 2015, the COP21 Paris Agreement, and many things had changed by then. By then, developing countries had become a majority of the pollution total. The EU had receded significantly in significance. It was no longer really that key player. The US still was as the largest polluter. No, China had overtaken the US by 2006. But the important thing was China-US cooperation was now significant. And so really what you'll see here is that China agreed with the US on proposals that actually were not to the best interests of the developing countries. So 3 proposals were made. Let's look at the right column. One is that all parties should declare their emission targets, which are these NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which had been proposed a year earlier at COP20. The developed countries, the DCs, will financially support the LDCs, the less developed countries' mitigation to a certain amount. They had proposed 30 billion a year to 2020 and 100 billion a year thereafter. And third proposal, which came from the group 77, the third one, was that abatement is conditional on funding. So they didn't want to abate unless there were guaranteed funds available. But China was able to get the developing countries to not agree on conditionality. And so here you get a sense of why this was important to the developing countries. You get I've got 2 methods of calculation here, and this is from the literature. So you see that China's marginal abatement cost per ton was 171.76, that first row. India's 203.05. The developed countries were much, much below that. So you can see the difference in affordability even for 2 large countries. For smaller countries with lower behind in technology, it would be even a bigger difference. So, and the second method shows the same thing. So now what happened at COP21 was, as I was saying, the starting position was that the developed countries wanted the developing countries now to come on board, but they didn't want to give funding or guaranteed funding. They said, we'll give voluntary funding. So that was the second set of proposals. That's what China got the group of 77 to agree to. And then we had this modified position where everyone agreed to everything. And that's what was agreed to finally. So that was the Paris Agreement. So quite different in its complexity from Kyoto, which required, in a way, more significant at the time bargaining. This was pretty much pre-agreed in advance between the US and China. But it's interesting, if you look at the documents that India and South Africa and Brazil signed, they've all said that they are agreeing to the Paris Agreement but conditional on funding. So they created their own little statement which was not part of the agreement. Here you can see, so I've taken the same number. If you look at that top one, it's what I showed you earlier. Look at the lower one, it's what came out of the Paris Agreement. So now both of them still generate 3 units of greenhouse gas emission reduction. But now what happens is if the developing countries abate, developed countries agree to transfer 2 units, $2, say, to the developing countries, and that changes the payoff from 4.2, if you look at the top, to 2.4. When both abate, the transfer is made. If you look at developing countries abating and developed countries polluting, then of course the net benefit is only 3. So so total goes down from 6 to 3. Similarly, if you see abate pollute, that is the first row, then developing countries don't abate; they continue to pollute. So the total benefit is only 3. So I thought this brings out the free rider problem quite well, and you can see that the equilibrium here now moves to abate. So the first row, for coalition 1 acting, coalition 2 will choose abate, and you can go through that exercise. So this is interesting because it shows that in a measurable way that if that conditionality had been there, this would have been a much more successful exercise. So getting China, but of course the problem is it may not have led to an agreement. So I think that was what had to be played off at the time. And then again, as the US had done in 2001, President Trump announced US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement in 2017. Became effective later, but effectively all cooperation with the COP and with China stopped. And against the targeted or promised amount, the actual amount has been puny, 5 billion a year. Now, why is it so low? So each has been hiding behind a smoke screen. The developed countries are saying, we can't see which developing countries are serious. They're coming forward and saying, we've done this much abatement, there are opaque institutional rules, we don't know what the actual number is, so we're not going to provide funds. And developing countries are saying, you're just hiding behind that smoke screen. So it's kind of a double moral hazard. Both of them are taking actions based on what they claim the other is doing. So failure. So that's what's happened in 2015, and now between 2015 and 2021 or 23, we move to the present time, and you see here that China-US cooperation started after 2005, where for the first time China recognized its own problems with climate change. It was observing degradation of its own environment, its own growth suffering as a result, and it was very vulnerable, as Mike Lampton and I were chatting about this morning, reminded me. So it's one of the more vulnerable countries. So it realized it needed to take some responsibility. Of course, it had that high growth period between 2010. The US and China collaborated closely at COP15, COP20, 21, and but after COP21, the collaboration fell off. So now coming to the question is, there are some new areas that matter. One is, geopolitical rivalry, but the big one, as I will show you now, is cost. The cost, which was estimated at the high end at $500 billion a year, as recently as COP21 in 2015, has now gone up to an average of $4 trillion a year. So that's now gone up from well below 1% of global GDP to 4%. And for most countries, this is unaffordable. And if you have, and it's becoming worse with every year. As greenhouse gas emissions continue, the gap is increasing. And so really finance becomes the core issue. It's not so much for creating a coalition and asking them to do something. It's finance that has to be looked at. And the second problem, of course, is geopolitical rivalry. It's often put in terms of compartmentalized, the US and many commentators telling China, okay, we're trying to destroy each other militarily at some point, maybe, but let's cooperate on climate change, because that's an existential threat to the whole world. That's kind of silly in a way, because if you're feeling an existential threat to your country from either China or the US to the other, you're not going to cooperate on climate change. So, but this is the apocalyptic scenario. If all countries now find that the cost has gone up, you can show that if costs exceed benefits, it's pretty obvious the equilibrium will be 0-0, which is the prisoner's dilemma solution, from which there is really no escape. So my argument continues here, arguing that geopolitical rivalry can actually be a help to climate change mitigation. Geopolitical rivalry is exercised in various ways. You want hard power, military alliances, sanctions, and so on, but you also compete through soft power. Pandemic leadership, climate change leadership, supporting the cause of the global south. At low levels of geopolitical rivalry, you'd expect that both countries, China and the US, would want to increase their soft power. And climate change offers a way to do that. So in a sense, partnering with the reason for partnership is that China can better manage a certain group of developing countries, but essentially the purpose has to be for finance. So, excuse me. But of course, there may be limits to soft power geopolitics. I mean, the fact is that hard power differentials can't be too large. So if there's a budget constraint that a country faces because of hard power rivalry, then it'll back off from soft power competition through climate change. So just trying to come down to the last few slides now. So this, this problem exists. And I put forward a modest proposal here that really finances the reason China and the US should create under COP an abatement guarantee mechanism with an initial guarantee by each to cover defaults of $10 billion, say. The AGM, the abatement guarantee mechanism would sit under COP, presumably be as depoliticized as it could be. The role of this AGM will be to determine the share of each developing country's future abatement that should be funded by overseas financial support. So that will hit one of those moral hazard problems. Receive donor pledges, certify abatement and measure its social benefit, call the pledges upon evidence of abatement. If they don't abate, it will call on if they don't come up with the money, it will go to the guarantors, China and the US, to put up the money. And then it will remit the funds to less developed countries per the share agreed, and make up shortfalls. Okay? And to solve the problem that many developed countries say we're sending our money in other ways, through the BRI and so on, only funds sent through AGM would be counted. Would it work? Well, I show here that it meets most of the challenges. Low abatement due to moral hazard is met through certification. Donor shortfall due to moral hazard is met by the guarantor system. The institutional issues of depoliticized functioning, the readiness of LDCs, and the geopolitics can also be addressed. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Just to summarize, I looked at the negotiating process, made the argument that cooperation is critical, found what kind of cooperation it should be, and then proposed a mechanism to address it. Thank you.
I just have one quick question. It is fantastic, very, very interesting. And I went back to the American Chamber of Commerce China big 3-day conference last week, and it was an amazing experience. You had the business sector, and you had the U.S. government, and then you had a few academics and NGOs there, and they're all pushing each other in different directions. So who's driving this forward in the U.S.? Who's pushing this? Who's pulling it? What force is it will get us to where you want us to go?
Good question. I think right now the cooperation is very sporadic. It's not been effective at all. So since Biden's come in, he's rejoined the Paris Agreement. The US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is still the defining framework. Within that now, some proposal has to be made that the finance that the developed countries said that they would give as public finance, then redefined into public and private finance, is not coming through. It's not going to come through unless you have some sort of mechanism that links the two. Now, either China or the US could make it, or maybe India could make it and say, we'll play a role as well.
So, but nobody's pushing it hard right now.
No.
Yeah, I mean, that's what, even in areas of public health and climate change, and the government backed off, and the businesses said, we want this collaboration, but it has to be supported by the government.
I mean, public-private partnerships, first the government has to do its bit, then the private sector comes in.
Right. So it's there's a lot of challenges there. So good. Thank you, Rafiq. That was fantastic. Scott, you're on stage.
Excuse me. Thanks, Rafiq. That was really good, and thanks, Scott, with 2 T's. I'm a former diplomat, so allow me a quick protocol point. One former president and at least one former minister in the audience. So Mr. President, Mr. Minister, apologies to anyone I missed. I'm speaking on a different topic under the rubric of sustainability and with a different approach that's not going to involve game theory, although I really appreciated what Rafiq did. I'm going to talk about sustainable cities, particularly in Southeast Asia, where I've spent most of my adult life. And let me start with what is a sustainable city? And it is one of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. It's SDG 11 for those who are counting. And so what is a sustainable city? It involves having access to safe, affordable housing and basic services, upgrading slums where they exist, access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transportation, efforts to protect cultural and natural heritage, reducing deaths and suffering from natural disasters, reducing the adverse environmental impact of cities, providing universal access to safe, green public spaces. In other words, it means making cities places that most of us would want to live and work. Right? So if we look at Southeast Asia, we've got to address the rapid urbanization, the development of megacities that's put massive pressure on so many governments and on so many cities. Already in Southeast Asia, about half the population lives in cities, with an expected 70 million more people living in those cities by 2025. They're drawn because that's where the jobs are. At least that's where people think the jobs are and the opportunities. So what does that result in? Overcrowding, slums, lack of public transport, pollution, flooding, lack of clean water and sewage, limited green space, limited access to healthcare in many cases, and often reliance on dirty sources of power. There's been in many cities in Southeast Asia a lot of unregulated growth with weak governance and inadequate planning. So cities are the economic drivers, right? They're attracting the workers. They take up 3% of the land, but account for 70% of emissions. So sustainable cities aren't just about emissions, but that's certainly a very important part. And it's not just the mega cities, the Bangkoks, Jakartas, Manilas, et cetera, but a lot of secondary cities. Just ask people who've been in Chiang Mai recently, which was suffering from record levels of air pollution just a few weeks ago. And that's true throughout Southeast Asia. And for those of you who've spent much time in big cities in Southeast Asia, you know about the traffic jams. The ASEAN report on sustainable cities cites the, quote, debilitating cost of traffic and overcrowding. Another important factor, Southeast Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change, rising sea levels, intensified storms. And what that means is the risk for city dwellers, floods, typhoons, earthquakes, rising sea levels, they all hit cities very hard. So there's a need to improve the resilience of the infrastructure and the social infrastructure to withstand and recover from these disasters. So the good news is ASEAN as an institution and most Southeast Asian governments, they recognize the problem, individual governments as well as the ASEAN institution. So in 2018, ASEAN launched the Sustainable Cities Program, plus the Smart Cities Program. Interesting, when I Googled sustainable cities, most of the responses I got were smart cities, as if they're the same. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same. Smart cities, having a smart city is key to becoming a sustainable city, but they're different things. So ASEAN has an annual conference of city officials to exchange best practices, and there has been progress in some areas. In Malacca, in Malaysia, they've been revitalizing old neighborhoods, encouraging walking, employing solar energy. In Hue, the old royal capital of Vietnam, still an important city, they're revitalizing the old quarter, making it more attractive for residents and tourists, planting more trees, creating more green space. So a lot of cities have come up with plans. Now we get to the fun part. Why is this so hard? Because if you go to some of the big cities in Southeast Asia, you'll see there's a lot of work still to do. You still see slums, incredible traffic jams, overcrowding, lack of public transport, and the like, and heavy reliance on coal-fired power plants in many cities. So what are the challenges? Weak local governance capacity, I would start with. Right? A lot of places just don't have high-quality governance at the local level. Sometimes a limited technical and technological ability to use technology to make progress. Often poor coordination between national and local authorities. Corruption, sadly, still a big problem. Difficulty obtaining affordable financing for projects is a huge problem. In some cases, lack of political will. So, political leaders may recognize the problem, but they lack the political will or the political support to invest in solutions. Often a lack of experience and know-how. How do you do integrated planning and management? I don't know how to do integrated planning and management for a city. I mean, I think it's asking a lot of local officials throughout the world that are facing lots of problems we shouldn't just assume that they know how to do this. And how do you use limited public money to leverage private sector investment, which obviously can multiply your financing? So let me get into just a couple of examples. These are cities I've happened to have lived in. Metro Manila, 14.7 million people. And Metro Manila includes 16 cities and 1 municipality. So there's the city of Manila, but there's a lot of other cities too. There's Quezon, there's Makati, there's Pasig, etc. So you've got multiple governance structures in one metropolitan area. Every year there's a Sustainable Cities Index that's put out. The 2022 Sustainable Cities Index, Metro Manila ranked 93rd out of 100. And that's 93, not in a good way, right? You want to be 1 or 2. It's one of the most densely populated cities in the world. It's got severe traffic congestion, air and water pollution, significant slums, lack of resilience to climate change. 31% of the city is subject to flooding, and some of that goes directly back to the issue of heavily polluted rivers. Only 70% of solid waste is collected in any kind of systematic way. In other words, 30% is not. A University of the Philippines study found that there has been a, quote, severe lack of implementation of the many plans that have been created. So the plans are there, it's the implementation that's the problem. Some cities within Metro Manila are doing better than others, but again, a lack of integrated, coordinated planning. So one idea that the Philippines is pursuing is the idea to build a new city up at the old Clark Air Base that would be the new Clark City. And the idea is to encourage people to move there and ease some of the congestion in Manila. But they have a long way to go. Another example is Jakarta. 11.25 million people living in a coastal city. The northern part of the city is basically a natural basin, and the rest is a river drainage area, so it's naturally prone to flooding. Any of you who read the New York Times story the other day will know that it's a sinking city, which is generally not something you want. A severe subsidence problem, in other words, it's sinking. Severe traffic jams, which I remember fondly. The good part is you can get a lot of work done in the car if somebody else is driving. Significant pollution. The World Bank ranks the Citarum River as the world's most polluted river. Again, lots of laws, rules, plans, but weak governance. Green areas, for example, are supposed to be 30% of the city. They're actually less than 10%. There's a lot of unregulated pumping of groundwater, which is where you get a lot of the subsistence. And again, it goes, in my view, to governance issues. I'll tell a story back in 2013 when I was there. Now President Jokowi was governor of Jakarta, and I went out with him one day to visit some areas of the city, and he was talking about the flooding and what needed to be done. And he said, well, first we need to dredge the various canals and rivers. That's key to basically go back to the natural drainage of the city. And I said, well, what's the holdup? Is it funding? He said, no, we have funding. The funding's there and it's used, but somehow the dredging doesn't happen. I said, how do you fix that? He said, it's easy. Tomorrow, we're going to dredge this canal. And I called up the head of the Jakarta State Dredging Company, and I said, we're going to dredge this canal tomorrow. I'll meet you there at 8. That's a pretty hands-on approach to governance, not necessarily practical, but it was one of the reasons that I think he was quite successful at the local level. So again, Jakarta's got all these problems. What's the solution? Well, one, when Jokowi was governor, he finally did build a metro for the city, a subway system. There had been, I think, 30 or more studies that had been sitting on shelves about building a metro. He managed to get it done. That helped. But the longer-term solution, at least according to President Jokowi, is to move the capital. And I'm going to talk about that next. If they pull this off, and it's a huge undertaking, it might help, but Jakarta is still going to have a lot of these problems. It's still going to be a big city that's sinking. So let me finish with what Indonesia is hoping will be a partial solution and what could serve as a model. The decision to move the capital and build a new capital city called Nusantara in East Kalimantan on the island of Borneo. It's a really ambitious plan. It's explicitly linked to the SDGs and to the climate accords. The plan is to reserve 25% to be controlled area to limit the carbon footprint. It will ban fossil fuel-driven transport. There's existing forest, but it's largely plantation forest. The plan is to turn that into tropical rainforest by gradually planting a variety of trees. It's to be powered almost totally by solar renewables with more than 20 reservoirs, which they consider basically parking places for the water. So it sounds great, but is it going to happen? I mean, that's the big question lots of people in Indonesia and outside are asking. Financing? It's going to be incredibly expensive. Abu Dhabi is investing some, but Indonesia is looking for a lot more investment in this. But then can you do the integrated planning? Can you actually implement? Can you avoid spilling over? So even let's say you build this nice new city and it meets all your obligations, what's the effect outside the city? If you've cut down a bunch of rainforest outside the city to build the city, or created other pollutants or what have you, then you've solved one problem and created another. There's a lot of skeptics about whether this is going to work. I'm not here to make a prediction. I think it's a huge undertaking, and given Indonesia's history of governance issues and, frankly, corruption, it's going to be a challenge. But if they can pull it off to even be reasonably successful, it's going to be big for Indonesia, but also potentially a model for others in the region. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. You talked about the Philippines and Indonesia, and I was shaking and nervously of all the problems and challenges they have. Is there a bright spot in Southeast Asia, a country that's taking this seriously and moving forward? And what, even if they're all 80 and above, the one that's the lowest, what are they doing that other countries aren't?
Well, you'll be very surprised to find out that Singapore is ranked one of the world's most sustainable cities. I mean, Singapore is Singapore, right? It's a unique entity. But A, it's got money. B, the Singapore national government just has to worry about the city of Singapore. And B, they've made it a priority. And they have quite effective governance. So they've done it. I think there's some places that have done bits and pieces of it. But it's hard just because the commitment that it takes and the level of governance. And one last point that I should have made, this is just my personal view. It's linked to the problem of developing high quality local governance, which means mayors and city councils or the equivalent that are ideally elected and thus accountable to the voters. And that exists in some countries, but not in others. Or sometimes those individuals exist, but they're not really given much resources or empowerment. So I think it requires a strengthening of local governments and obviously a major commitment, plus the ability to raise funds, which it's really expensive in a lot of these countries to raise money. They're raising it 9 or 10% instead of 4 or 5%. And that just makes everything really hard.
I see. Are the international banks or international system doing anything to support this?
Yeah, I mean, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank both have programs, and it's linked also to other programs that overlap, like meeting the climate goals, clean energy transition. So if you can shift more coal-fired power plants to cleaner energy, then you at least get at some of the air pollution and similar problems. It doesn't solve everything else.
I see. Good. Okay, well, I'm sure we'll be back with lots of questions for you when we open up the audience. Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to the speakers. I was glad to get out of my medical school hole and hear about economics and politics. It's been very fun. So my name's Latha Palaniappan. I'm a professor of medicine here at Stanford. And I do NIH-funded work, our federal government-funded work in cardiovascular disease and diabetes, mainly in Asian subpopulations. For my clinical work, I do pharmacogenomics, which is a new field in which we understand your genetic responses to drugs that we prescribe. And one of our challenges in medicine is that many of these drugs and devices are studied in populations that are not Asian. And 1 out of 3 of our Bay Area population is Asian, and 60% of the world is Asian. So one of the things that we are trying to do at the Stanford Center for Asian Health Research and Education is to increase research and improve education in these areas. So sustainability is related to that because healthy people equal a healthy planet. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how we can work together, and I was very heartened to hear that the previous speakers had mentioned some of these similar concepts. So looking forward to bringing them together for us on an individual level. So we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on human health. And I'm going to focus in on asthma and cardiovascular disease because these are my areas of research, cardiovascular disease in particular, and we're going to drill down a little bit more on air pollution. There were other areas of this circle that were mentioned here, and many of you may be experiencing, particularly with the beautiful flowers that we have on campus, increasing allergens and respiratory allergies and asthma. We talked a little bit about water quality and its impacts in cities, and also the extreme heat that that certain parts of the country are experiencing now, and as well as severe weather. So how are health and sustainability connected? So unhealthy, unsustainable lifestyles have excess food consumption at its core, unhealthy diets and excess food waste, and lack of physical activity, and we talked about a little bit of that in the previous talk, and over-reliance on vehicles. And we really want more people-powered transportation so we can have more physical activity, which will reduce chronic diseases. The threatened environment due to pollution, deforestation, and a decrease in biodiversity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. And through climate change and extreme weather, and also directly, this leads to cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and respiratory diseases, as well as other negative health outcomes. Anyone in their family or themselves have cardiovascular disease, cancer, or respiratory disease in the room? Raise your hand. In your family? The prevalence of these diseases are about 90%, so maybe this is not translating well. So the Sustainable Development Goals were mentioned, and we have some nice pins around the room, Cheryl has. And I'm going to focus on the health-related Sustainable Development Goals. These were mentioned earlier. So good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, sustainable cities and communities, which our previous speaker referred to, climate action, life below water, as well as life on land, and how we can create partnerships for these goals. So these are all the diseases except infectious diseases, which we hear about a lot, are preventable by healthy lifestyles. So according to the World Health Organization, a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding tobacco can prevent 80% of premature heart disease, 80% of type 2 diabetes, and 40% of all cancer. So air pollution is a major contributor to non-communicable diseases, as we talked about. So every year, air pollution causes 7 million deaths around the world. And you can see that Asia and Southeast Asia are well represented in this, proportional to the population in the world. And we can, by reducing air pollution levels, we can reduce stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, and other respiratory diseases. So air pollution is responsible in part for 10% of all deaths in the world. And 95% of these deaths occur in low middle income countries. The developing countries, as our first speaker categorized them. So we talked a little bit about pollution in relation to health. Let's talk about our diets and sustainability in relation to health. So in sum, less meat equals less pollution. So as a physician that specializes in cardiovascular disease, I recommend that patients, as much as possible, eat vegetarian or vegan diets, plant-based diets. This is related to sustainability because in order to produce meat, we deforest lands to provide land for livestock. We grow crops that provide feed for livestock. The livestock is killed and manufactured to create meat. And this results in environmental effects, including habitat loss and species extinction, increased water consumption to support the land. Animal waste contributes to excess land and water pollution, and this increases greenhouse gas emissions through production and manufacturing. So there are several values that we need to instill in order to create sustainable health. So a culture of healthy and sustainable living, equitable solutions across countries, cultural humility in incorporating these solutions, technological innovations, and collaboration from the individual to the policy level. And this includes culturally appropriate and sustainable nutrition options, protecting biodiversity and reducing food waste and overconsumption, reducing greenhouse gas emissions through less reliance on vehicles, promoting exercise through green spaces and informed urban development, and reducing toxic emissions and cigarette waste and decreasing deforestation. So often in population health, we talk about the socio-ecological model, and this helps orient us into individual level decisions and behaviors such as an unhealthy diet or less physical activity, nested within different levels of our community, business and supply chain entities, and government. So for an individual to make healthy lifestyle and sustainable action choices, this needs to be nested in a community with a collective culture of sustainable living and education and social networks that support these sustainable choices. And this is nested within business and supply chain entities, including culturally appropriate foods and produce, reduction in pollution, a built environment to promote exercise and green spaces, which is nested within governments that collaborate with various stakeholders across Asia and abroad internationally, and policies promoting health and sustainability. So in order to create this virtuous cycle for healthier populations and a healthier planet, we need to implement policies that support healthy lifestyle and environment, provide resources to support healthy lifestyles while implementing cultural considerations, improve health through sustainable lifestyle choices, collectively reduce pollution, food waste, and overconsumption, and constantly use data and metrics to inform progress of reaching these sustainable development goals. So for future directions, we need to emphasize primary and preventive care to improve prevalence of non-communicable diseases in Asia, leverage technological innovations to improve outreach, particularly in rural areas, and engage with partners from the community through to the international level through collaboration. So I wanted to just end by thanking you for including me, Dr. Shin, in this panel. And I wanted to mention we have a website for the Center for Asian Health Research and Education. And as we move forward for precision health for Asians, we encourage you to think about this as you think about sustainability, how individuals can benefit from planetary sustainability. So thank you.
Yes, I was listening to this and thinking about implementing these policies to get there. And it seems like it's even harder than trying to, he wanted to build sustainable cities, or was talking about that. And you had this whole, you had 6 or 7 other of these goals. Is there being progress made towards them, and who's driving this progress, and what's maybe holding it back, and what can we do to get it going? Just a small little question.
Well, briefly, I think we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go in attaining these goals. And if you look at, for instance, air pollution, we've improved considerably since the Industrial Revolution, but we still have a long way to go. And deaths due to air pollution are more than the deaths due to TB, malaria, and HIV combined. And I am confident, particularly with what we've been able to do in those 3 diseases, in addition to COVID-19 in a very short amount of time, I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to make some improvements.
So it's good. I've got to ask all the questions so far. I think now we want to open it up to the audience, and there's the microphones, and once you line up and ask the questions, and you are number 1. Say who you are, and then...
my name is Gita
yeah.
Waryawan. I'm a visiting scholar here, and I'm friends with Scott, with 1 T. I've gone through a couple of the COPs, and I've found those meetings to be of great difficulty, particularly for somebody that comes from a developing country. And I've made the observation that the narrative of sustainability is one that's noble, but only resonates to perhaps only 20% of the population of the world. Whereas the remaining 80% of the population of the world are still worried about putting food on the table. And I represent one of those many developing countries, alongside India, alongside Nigeria. I think for anybody on the planet to be able to embrace fully the narrative of sustainability, it requires for him or her to be able to think in a modern way. And I've been struggling to figure out, how do you define modernity or modernization? There's so many metrics to measure modernity. But one metric that's relevant to me is electrification. Because without electricity, you can't modernize. And if I take a look at countries like India and Indonesia with power generation capabilities of a little over 400,000 megawatts in India and about 74,000 megawatts in Indonesia, they translate to about an electrification of about 1,000 per kilowatt hour per capita. And for any nation to be modern, it needs to be electrified to the extent of at least 5,000 kilowatt hour. A typical middle income country is electrified at about 6,000 kilowatt. Now for India and Indonesia to multiply its electrification on a per capita basis 5 times, at the rate India only builds about 19,000 megawatts a year in the last 10 to 15 years, at a rate that Indonesia has been building only 3,000 megawatts per year in the last 10 to 15 years, it's going to take 98 years for India and Indonesia. And to put more drama into this, Nigeria, which is a fellow developing country, is electrified only to the extent of 155 kilowatt hour per capita, whereas India and Indonesia are about 1,000. So I think some of our friends in Africa are not going to modernize until maybe a few hundred years from today. And this is highly irreconcilable with the narrative of sustainability which needs to be attained by 2050, which is only 27 years away from today. I think that's a warning.
You're doing okay. Keep going.
My point is, you know, I get solar, I get wind, I get hydro, but they're not scalable, right? And I keep knocking myself in the head, knowing that 7 to 8 million people die on a yearly basis because of pollution, because we emit 35 to 40 gigatons of carbon every year. The only obvious solution to me is something that's clean and scalable. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's nuclear. Why is it that the notion of nuclear does not get into the conversation, much less discourse? That's my question to anyone.
Good. So I think we'll just open that up to.
May I take it from a health perspective
just
first?
hold up a finger in your neck.
Okay,
You're
thank
first.
you.
You're
Thank
first,
you.
Latha.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to approach it from a health perspective because, and I'll use my own experience contrasting Indians in India versus Indian Americans in the Bay Area. And what I have observed is that Indians in India in urban areas have very similar lifestyles to Indians that immigrated first to the United States in the 1970s, as my father did. And my father, incidentally, died of a heart attack at 39. What Indians in urban India are doing are exactly the lifestyles of the 1970s in the United States, in terms of sitting in cars in traffic for hours at a time, in terms of sitting at desks, not getting physical activity, eating packaged food. And so what I would like, and we're getting to this in high socioeconomic status areas of the United States, what happens here? In Menlo Park, where I live, people go to the farmer's market. They ride bikes on campus here. And so, and I'm not going to speak from the energy perspective because that's not my expertise, but I do think that there's opportunities to skip over bad habits. And my challenge is, how can I get, for instance, in rural India, people who are eating local food and having lots of physical activity to not climb that industrial mountain of sitting in cars and eating packaged food to, riding bikes and going to farmers markets. So how can I get from here to here?
So, you've talked about electrification as a solution. So I assume you're meaning not just electrification as it is conventionally defined as using more electricity to provide goods and services. For example, switching from carbon-based steel production to electricity-based steel production, electric vehicles, all the commercial machinery that you use for production, move from oil and gas sources of energy to electrifying them. That's one huge area of activity which so far there's been very little progress. I think China is one of relatively more advanced at about 12% electrification. And then you have you have energy sources which are clean, like renewables, solar panels, wind, geothermal power, and so on. And you talked about nuclear as an option. Now, on a cost basis, the equations are changing very rapidly. As China has been bringing down the cost of production. And today you have renewables based on wind and solar without standby power, so not for peak loads, not for base loads, is about 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. It doubles if you add storage, so it becomes 8, 9 cents, but they're still much, much cheaper than nuclear. So if renewables-based energy generation is unaffordable, as even my presentation was showing, I mean, nuclear is far more unaffordable to do it at that scale. So that's one comment I wanted to make. The other was your question about, you talked about, in terms of the growth rate, I mean, of pollution, it's sort of shooting up. I think in terms of social conscience, I think all countries now buy into it. They always all bought into it. I mean, I think it's just that there are other national priorities, as you say, put food on the table, that comes against that. I mean, the US has done it in 2001, 2017, said, we don't want to sacrifice. If you see why the US withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, it said explicitly that we don't want to sacrifice economic growth. So, all countries do it, but I think now the momentum is there that everyone recognizes that not too far off in the distant future, you're going to face some significant problems from climate change. So I'm not that worried about commitment, I'm more worried about cost. Yeah, so that's it. When everyone is bought into climate change, it's to save lives. So that cost of lives, I think people understand. But they also need to be able to see that, if you're going to get the benefit after 30 years, 40 years, somebody has to take the present value of that and pay it now. That's what the rich countries can do. Poor countries cannot afford to wait 40 years to get the payback.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I'll just add 2 quick points. One is it seems to me that various technologies should be part of the conversation. Whether they're always the solution is a different story, but nuclear, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, which are still, in more infant stages, should all be part of the discussion. And then the second point, and I think this gets a little bit at what both of you were saying, is how much can you address the modernity gap through increased energy efficiency as well? So it's not just mass, how many kilowatt hours per capita, but the efficiency of that. And I think there's room for that as well.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. Tom, you're first, and Don, you're next.
Okay. Tom Finger from APARC. Thank you for the presentation. Together they demonstrate the complexity of the interconnected issues. They're all difficult. They're all necessary. They're all interactive. And to some extent, they're all in competition with one another for time, attention, resources. Is there any sort of modal template for countries or communities to look at, say, to get the biggest bang for the buck in the shortest possible time for demonstration effect, for improvement in health? Pick from this menu? Or are we still building out all of the possible considerations and all of the possible competitors for time and attention, which translates into even more excuses for waiting until we understand better? So give me a blueprint.
Can I go first again?
Thanks, Tom.
Eat plants, walk everywhere. Done.
See, the Nordic countries have done a good job of balancing everything. So I think if there is a blueprint, that's where one should look for it.
What's that? Say that again?
Norway, Sweden, I mean, the Scandinavian countries have done a really good job of balancing all these things.
But, Norway's per capita fiscal revenues is probably greater than, not their per capita one, their total revenues for a country of 5 million are probably greater than the 300 million people in Indonesia, right? And that's what allows them to do it. I thought that was what the question of Gita was, how do we do it? How do these countries that don't
Scale.
Yeah, I mean.
May I add Japan, highest longevity in the world, and
May.
many of the same principles in terms of healthy lifestyles that are sustainable.
And I think I don't know the blueprints. I mean, certainly the Nordics. I find it, now that I'm no longer a diplomat, I can say I find it mildly annoying that the Nordics are always better at everything.
They're richer.
You got to give them credit. But, I think the cost of finance right, is a big problem. There's a huge gap in the cost of finance between what you can, borrow in the US or maybe London or Tokyo and what you can borrow in much of the world, even for governments. And that's a huge barrier, whether you're addressing health issues or cities or climate change. So that's a major economic and financial problem. And then the second thing I think is what we see in our own country on climate change, right? People can, of course not everybody agrees, but a lot of people can agree that climate change is a problem. But even though there's more evidence every day that it's here already, it's still, for politicians, hard to pay what they see as the political cost for investing something that's not seen as quite as urgent or immediate as a lot of other issues. And that's just a political problem of getting politicians to be courageous, which I don't think anyone's ever figured out.
No, I think that's a huge part of the issue right there. That's very good. Don.
I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but the panel strikes me as an extraordinarily comprehensive three-layer cake. We started with the top layer, COP, and we're talking about states, globally, right? High level of, I suppose you could say, abstraction, although you did get into specifics, so I don't deny that there are things that need to be done at that level, absolutely, right? And then we come down to the cities, right? With regard to the cities, Scott, I'm intrigued by the difference between what is sustainable and what is smart. Now, that may seem like an unfair contrast, as if sustainability isn't smart. But think of it for a moment. Poverty is sustainable. It's not smart, right? Instead of saying the future of sustainability without identifying what you are trying to sustain, maybe the appropriate title for the panel is the future of humanity. I mean, maybe that's going a little bit too far. And the difference between sustainable cities and smart cities, in my experience in Southeast Asia, based particularly on the Singapore model, which Geeta has talked about. And there are a lot of good things about the Singapore model, don't misunderstand. Very, very attractive in many ways. But there's also a different dimension. I know scholars who have been at Singapore, absorbed the notion of the smart city in a smart city, and then gone to other parts of Southeast Asia to, in a sense, reproduce it through research. And I sometimes ask them, I say, well, what is smart? For example, insofar, and here we get to the third and final level, at the lowest level of human beings and individuals actually behaving, doing things that they should or should not do, in some sense, a smart city would be able to, all right, using a harsh term, control the behavior of the individuals that you worry about at that very, because they don't walk, right? They ride, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They have the wrong diet and so forth and so on. And that therefore, at that level of the individual, frankly, we're talking about control. The social credit system in China might be ideally suited for the kind of rigorous change in individual behavior that is essential to take care of this problem, which of course, Scott, you're right. I remember the days when climate change was something that people in developing countries said, oh, that you people in the North worry about that. We don't worry about that. Well, what was a gray rhino, I guess you could say, is now a black swan. That is to say, except it's not a black swan because we predicted it. It's a black rhino, let's put it that way. We've known it's around. We've been around for a long time. But now, every day there are consequences. The weather is causing massive movements of people. And that's why, for example, the Southeast Asia program has for many years run a Lee Kong Chan Fellowship. I've been struck by the extent to which we get about 30, 35, 40, after we filter them, applications every year. And increasingly, those applications are from Southeast Asians who want to study migration. And the idea here is that, I'm being really crude, and I don't have the expertise that justifies my saying this, understand that. But arguably, there is a band around the middle of the planet, on either side of the equator, a tropical band, including in Southeast Asia, which is most vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, and which therefore will generate a massive movement of human beings. You know, maybe towards Australia in one direction and maybe towards North America in another direction. Not that North America is all that secure from climate change, don't misunderstand. So these are dramatic problems of the daily news. This is no longer a long-term situation. And I'm just intrigued, do any of you have a sense of how we can link those three levels from the very top down to the level of individual behavior? And again, I return to something I've implied before in my questions, the issue of control, of constructive control, of smart control, not sustainability in some abstract sense.
Wow.
Yes, exactly.
So all I got from that is Stanford professor urges adoption of Chinese
Social credit.
No, I'm just joking, Don.
Just the middle layer of the cake was talking. So
Well, I'll comment. I guess I don't like health being the lowest layer or it being cake, but I'll comment. The way that we think about it in terms of health behaviors is making it the default choice, right? We've all been in situations where it's better to walk or bike or take public transportation than take your car and park it in a densely populated area, whether the parking be too high or the traffic be too much. And it would be about making default choices, the healthy choice being the default choice, right? So, and we've done this in other areas of health with different layers of intervention. I encourage you to think back to the 1950s and how many people smoked in the United States, and we've done a great job of decreasing smoking rates, particularly in California. And currently, 50% of men in China smoke, right? So how can we apply what we've learned in the United States? And I don't claim that knowledge is only an export, it's also an import. We also have a lot to learn from developing countries. For instance, in India, a baby is delivered in an ambulance every 4 minutes. A baby is never delivered in an ambulance in the United States. It'd be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or New York Times if that happened. And they are able to deliver a baby in the back of an ambulance for $2. You know how much it costs to deliver a baby in the United States? About $20,000. So I think we have a lot to learn from other countries as well. And I think that this can be applied in sustainable, healthy behaviors as well as what we've done with cigarette smoking and decreasing healthcare costs. I was surprised to learn how much it costs to decrease emissions, and that now it's 4% of the GDP. Many of you in the room probably know that healthcare is 18% of the US GDP now. And if we can spend that money to decrease the healthcare GDP, that seems like a win-win.
Yeah, I would partially answer your question, I think, this way, Don. It seems to me that, again, there's work to be done at the national and international level. That's hugely important. But there's a lot that is being done and can be done at the local level. So, for example, when you look at sustainable cities, smart meaning basically using technology to try to increase efficiencies, et cetera. It's, I think, encouraging, rather than control, although there may be aspects of that make sense, it's encouraging and facilitating. So if you want people walking and taking clean public transportation and having access to healthcare within a reasonable distance, and that goes into city urban planning and design, so that you have to make it easier for people. Short of forcing them to do things, you make it easier for them. Some of that, on the control side, you do by playing with costs of driving. How much you charge for tolls or for use of highways or these sorts of things. So there's some coercive, if I can use that term, aspect to it without controlling people's, what did they order for breakfast?
Incentives.
Yeah, incentives and using those sorts of things. But I think you know, if you're in a city where public transportation is easier and less expensive than driving, more people are going to use that, and that probably means some walking as well, right? And if it's, you know, and if you're putting, creating incentives to put solar panels on rooftops and other things, you know, there's a lot of things that you can be done short of coercion, I think.
Mike, you're going to have the final question, so push these guys.
I have one short question and two short observations.
Very good.
How's
Okay,
that?
perfect.
On the smoking, I remember in 1979, I went with the HEW secretary to China, and Joe Califano was running a big global anti-smoking campaign, and we talked to the Minister of Health in China. He said the biggest problem we have on stopping smoking in China is that our finance ministry gets huge revenues from the tobacco tax, right? Like nothing we can do about that. And then he went on to the movie industry that glorified chain smoking revolutionaries fighting the Japanese and so on. So you've got a lot of supportive systems that actually have an affirmative interest in the kind of negative behavior you're talking about. So I'd say that's the first thing. Secondly, I actually was a little ambivalent when I got my air ticket to come to here. For the first time that I'd ever saw, it noted how many pounds of carbon it was going to get me here. And I think it was 1,165 pounds, which seems to me a lot. That was one way, right? So, you know, would we be having conferences like this if we all actually realized the fallout? So I just a couple of observations, questions to Rafiq, and that is you had this, I forget the adjustment fund to which the United States and China would each contribute hypothetically $10 billion. And my question is, would the United States and China agree to put equal amount there? Wouldn't we both be arguing what is equal? Is it equal 10 billion or is it per capita? Or, well, in other words, could we actually agree on a number?
So actually, they did agree in 2015. China put in 3.1 billion, and the US committed 3 billion. That was meant to start off that GCF, the Green Climate Fund. So I mean, there is precedent. Now, what I'm asking for here is not that they put in the 10 billion each, but that they guarantee 10 billion. If there are shortfalls from developed countries or others that can afford to pay, then, you know, first option is for the US to go and tell the shortfall country, provided it's not the US itself that's falling short. So, you know, you owed this money, pay up. And if they don't pay, then the guarantee is called. So that might, but there is precedent for money being put in.
Yes, well, do you have one quick question? Okay, we have like two more minutes.
Thank you so much, Halimori from Public. I have seen that the most death due to the pollution is in the most populated places. And when I go to many seminars, I realize that Earth cannot sustain so high population that we have. And elephant in the room for poverty and sustainability is population, and nobody talks about limiting population by maybe control. Because nobody admit that if China didn't control the population, would never become like in this situation that they are. I know the negative impact of the things, but still, if they didn't control, they would never progress. I am wondering why nobody talks about the elephant in the room, population growth and control of that.
Well, so I did get a chance to look up these statistics, and those who are more well-versed in pollution can correct me if I'm wrong, but pollution has gone down despite the fact that population has gone up. And I think that's due to technological innovations like catalytic converters on cars, more electric vehicles, though that hasn't affected things that much in terms of pollution. But it is not sort of hand in hand that more people increases pollution. And I am, again, optimistic, glass half full, that with further technological innovations that we'll be able to sustain the populations that we have and continue to decrease pollution. I will also say that as countries become more well-resourced, and countries in Asia among them, Japan, Korea, the birth rate goes down naturally without control. There's not even replacement in those countries. And so then we have to think about how do we, and this is sort of another topic, but how do we deal with an inverted demographic pyramid, right? Yeah. So next time.
That's a good point. I mean, I think, there's this Malthusian theory's been around for, 150 years or whatever.
At Stanford.
Did it? Yeah, most good things started at Stanford. But
Yes.
The idea that the population, the Earth couldn't sustain the population. And so far that's proven not to be true, although that doesn't guarantee in the future. But again, I think it comes down to technology, a changing of policies, changing of practices. But I would say, going back to my presentation on sustainable cities, part of the trouble in Southeast Asia, and I think in a lot of the world, is not just the size of the absolute size of the population, but the concentration in these mega cities. Why? Well, because people think that's where they can get ahead. That's where the job opportunities are. So it's important, and I think governments recognize this. How do you encourage policies to discourage everybody from going to city A or city B, and having more sustainable, if you will, towns and cities where there are opportunities everywhere, which is more of a policy question, less about the total size of your population.
Good. So let's, well, I first of all want to thank the panelists. I don't need to give much of a summary. I thought Dawn had it perfect. This was a cake. It was somebody, Christian Cheryl, organized it well and put the icing on it, and then the cake, and then the base, and they were very interrelated, and that the problems were the same problems as we went down here. The incentives. We needed some economists on the panel, because it's basically incentives to do it right. And it's the lack of incentives of why people aren't doing it, and with the distance of time. I thought the hardest thing about this climate change policies is there's not one leader that's been at COP, who's going to be leader when climate change really comes to pass, though that's starting to change now. And I think it's getting the incentives and getting the institutions and the structures and the knowledge together at all of these levels is what we need to go forward. And I thought it was a great session. I want to give a hand and